The finality of the act was in the sound the door made. It was not a slam of anger, but a heavy, oiled click of a lock turning, a sound of commerce and conclusion. Behind the door was Gideon, her husband's brother, his face set in a mask of grim piety. In her hand were 30 silver dollars and a folded deed. On the dusty street of Providence Creek stood all that was left of her life, a worn traveling pack, the clothes on her back, and Borrow, her late husband's hound, whose quiet presence was the only warmth in a world suddenly gone cold. Gideon had read the will in the church hall, his voice resonating with false sorrow. Thomas, his brother, Ilara's husband, was gone, lost in the mine collapse that had taken 6 men from the town. The mine, Gideon's mine, was now closed. The assets were frozen, he explained, the debts overwhelming. There was almost nothing left. He made a show of generosity, pressing the coins into her palm. For your immediate needs, Ilara, and this. Thomas insisted on buying it years ago, a foolish sentiment. The deed was for a patch of useless land miles from town, an abandoned stone quarry known to everyone in Providence Creek as Gideon's Folly. It was a blasted hole in the earth, a place of shattered rock and howling wind, valuable to no one. The townspeople watched the transaction with downcast eyes. They felt a flicker of pity, quickly extinguished by the certainty of her fate. She was a widow, penniless, with nothing but a worthless deed and a dog. "You can work in my house," Gideon offered, loud enough for the onlookers to hear his magnanimity. "The laundry needs a steady hand." The offer was an insult wrapped in charity, a sentence to a life of servitude and quiet shame under the roof of the man who had just stripped her of everything. She looked at his polished shoes, then at the faces in the small crowd. The store owner, Mr. Gable, who averted his gaze, the hunter, Brant, who watched with a detached curiosity, the mayor, who nodded in solemn agreement with Gideon's decision. They expected her to weep, to beg, to accept the scraps he offered. Instead, a silence fell over her, a cold, hard thing that took root in her bones. She turned from Gideon without a word and walked directly to Mr. Gable's mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, a sound too cheerful for the moment. Inside, she laid her $30 on the counter. "A good axe," she said, her voice steady. "A pick, 20 pounds of salt, and a bag of winter seeds." Mr. Gable stared at the coins, then at her. "Ilara? What are you thinking? That land is a grave. Take a ticket east. Forget this place." His advice was meant as kindness, but it felt like another lock clicking shut. She shook her head. "The tools," she repeated. He sighed and complied, his movements slow with disapproval. She packed the supplies, hoisted the heavy axe to her shoulder, and walked out of the store, Borrow trotting silently at her heel. She did not look back. She turned her face toward the high, empty hills and began to walk. The journey was a punishment. The sun beat down, then the wind rose, a relentless force that stole the warmth from her skin and tore at her worn dress. The path dwindled from a wagon-rutted track to a faint trail, then to nothing at all. She moved through a landscape of rock and tough, low scrub. The weight of the tools and supplies was a crushing burden, each step an act of will. Borrow stayed close, a shadow of brown fur and quiet loyalty, his panting a steady rhythm against the sigh of the wind. She walked for the better part of a day, the town shrinking behind her until it was just a smudge of wood smoke in the vast, indifferent landscape. The isolation was absolute. There were no birds, no signs of life beyond the hiss of wind through dry grass. The land felt ancient and hostile, a place that endured but did not welcome. She crested a final ridge and saw it. The quarry. It was worse than the stories. It was a wound in the earth, a great gaping pit of gray and brown rock, its walls sheer and fractured. Heaps of rubble and discarded shattered stones littered the floor. The wind, funneled by the high walls, howled through the space, a mournful, shrieking sound that seemed to come from the rock itself. It was a place of ruin, a testament to a failed enterprise. This was her inheritance, a hole, a place of death and failure, the strength that had carried her from town drained away, replaced by a cold, hollowing dread. Her knees felt weak. The weight of the axe seemed to pull her to the ground. Mr. Gable was right. Gideon was right. The whole town was right. This was a grave. Tears, hot and sharp, finally stung her eyes. She had been so determined, so full of a cold, hard fire. Now, faced with the reality of this desolate place, the fire guttered, leaving only the bitter ash of despair. Borrow, sensing her collapse, nudged his head against her hand, whining softly. He then trotted away, toward the back wall of the quarry, disappearing behind a massive pile of fallen rock. He barked once, a sharp, questioning sound that cut through the wind's howl. She wiped her eyes on her sleeve, took a ragged breath, and followed. She squeezed through a narrow gap in the rockfall and found him standing before a dark fissure in the quarry face, a crack just wide enough for a person to enter. The air at the mouth of the fissure was different. The wind did not penetrate. It was utterly still. Hesitantly, she stepped inside, into the cool darkness. The sound of the wind vanished, replaced by a profound silence. She took a few more steps into the rock, her eyes slowly adjusting. The fissure was a natural passage, deeper than it looked, and as she moved further from the entrance, she felt it. A change, a subtle, pervasive warmth. It wasn't the heat of the sun, it was coming from the stone itself, a gentle, steady heat rising from the floor beneath her feet. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against the rock. It was warm to the touch. Borrow lay down, sighing with contentment. Despair did not vanish, but it retreated. In its place, a new feeling began to grow, a grim, fierce, and powerful resolve. The worthless place had a secret. The work began at dawn the next day. It was a battle against stone. Her first task was to clear the entrance to the fissure, to move the tons of rock that blocked it. She used the pick, swinging it until her arms screamed and her shoulders felt torn from their sockets. The shock of each blow traveled up the handle, jarring her teeth. Her hands, soft from a life of domestic tasks, blistered within the first hour. By noon, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin. She tore strips from her petticoat and wrapped them around her palms and kept working. She learned the language of rock, its weight, its balance, its breaking points. She used smaller stones as fulcrums and a stout log as a lever, slowly, painstakingly shifting boulders that seemed immovable. Each one that rolled away was a victory, earned with sweat and blood and a litany of silent curses. Borrow watched her, a silent guardian, occasionally letting out a low growl at a shadow or a strange sound. For 2 weeks, this was her entire world. The bite of the pick, the grate of stone on stone, the fire in her muscles, and the slow, agonizing widening of the passage to her sanctuary. With the entrance cleared, she began to build. The quarry was a chaotic library of building materials. She chose the best of the discarded blocks, square-hewn and solid, and began the brutal task of hauling them to the fissure. She built a crude sled from scavenged wood, but mostly she used her own body, dragging and rolling the stones into place. She started to construct a wall across the mouth of the fissure, leaving only enough space for a door and a small high opening for light. She needed mortar. She remembered her father, a stonemason, talking about old ways. She found a deposit of dense clay near a seep at the bottom of the quarry and sand from a weathered section of the wall. She mixed them with water, pounding the mixture with a rock until it formed a thick, sticky paste. It was crude, but it worked. She laid the first course of stones, filling the gaps with her clay mortar, her raw hands burning from the grit. The wall rose with agonizing slowness, a single line of stone against the vast emptiness of the quarry. The days bled into one another, a relentless cycle of labor. She rose with the first light, her body a single, unified ache. She worked until the sun fell behind the quarry rim, and then collapsed onto her bedroll inside the fissure, letting the gentle warmth of the stone floor seep into her exhausted muscles. She ate sparingly, dried meat and hard biscuits she'd brought from town. The work was changing her. The softness was burning away, leaving behind something harder, more resilient. Her hands calloused over, the muscles in her back and arms grew dense and strong. She was becoming a creature of this rock, shaped by its hardness and her own unyielding will. Next came the roof. She needed wood. A thin stand of hardy pines clung to the ridge above the quarry. Felling the first tree was a clumsy, terrifying ordeal. The axe felt alien in her hands. Her swings were inefficient, glancing off the tough bark. But she persisted, chopping and hacking, until, with a great groan, the tree shuddered and fell. Dragging the logs down the steep slope to the quarry floor was another brutal challenge. She did it one log at a time, a slow, punishing process that took days. She laid the logs across the top of her stone walls, creating a sturdy frame. Then she climbed back up the slope and began cutting thick squares of sod, the kind with dense, tangled roots. She hauled these down and layered them over the log frame, packing them tightly. On top of the sod she placed a final layer of flat stones, creating a living roof that was heavy, insulated, and almost indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. The final piece was a door, fashioned from the thickest parts of the pine logs, held together with wooden pegs and hung on leather hinges. The first time she closed it, the sound of the wood settling into the stone frame was the most satisfying thing she had ever heard. She was enclosed. She was safe. With the primary shelter built, she turned to the systems that would keep her alive. The geothermal heat was the heart of it all. She built a raised sleeping platform of flat stones directly over the warmest section of the floor, creating a bed that was perpetually, luxuriously warm. For cooking and light, she built a small fireplace against the back wall of solid rock. She noticed a tiny secondary fissure high above it, snaking its way to the surface. With immense difficulty, she used smaller stones and clay to line this fissure, creating a natural, almost invisible chimney. When she lit the first fire, the smoke drew perfectly, vanishing into the rock. From outside the quarry, there was no sign of life, no column of smoke to betray her presence. Water was next. Deep within the fissure, a steady drip, drip, drip of water seeped from the stone. It was pure and cold. Using her pick, she spent a week painstakingly chipping a narrow channel in the floor, guiding the water from the seep along the wall to a low point near her living area. There she dug a shallow basin and lined it with the same thick clay she'd used for mortar, packing it down until it was watertight. It took 2 days for the cistern to fill, a slow miracle of clear, life-giving water, safe from the freezing temperatures that would soon grip the world outside. Her greatest gamble was the garden. Using buckets, she hauled rich, dark soil from a sheltered hollow she'd found below the pine grove. Inside the fissure, in the constant, gentle warmth, she laid out a long, shallow bed of soil. By the faint, flickering light of her tallow lamp and the sliver of daylight from the high window, she planted her seeds, potatoes, carrots, onions, and a few hardy greens. It seemed like an act of madness, planting a garden in the heart of a stone mountain as winter approached. But the warmth from the floor was constant, a subterranean summer. Weeks had passed. Her supplies were dwindling. It was time to return to town. The walk back to Providence Creek was different. She was leaner, harder, and her stride was sure. When she entered Gideon's mercantile, the patrons fell silent. Her clothes were tattered and stained, her face smudged with dirt, her hands calloused and scarred. She looked feral, a creature of the wilderness. She ignored the stares and walked to the counter. Gideon looked her over with a faint, contemptuous smile. "Come back for that laundry position, Alara?" he asked, his voice slick with mock sympathy. "I told you the wilderness was no place for a grieving woman." "I need 2 goats," she said, her voice raspy from disuse, 6 laying hens, and 2 sacks of grain. A ripple of disbelief went through the store. Gideon's smile faltered, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. "Livestock? What in God's name are you doing out there? Are you building an ark in that rock pile?" The men in the store chuckled. The joke spread quickly. Ilara in her folly, buying animals to keep in a cave. She counted out the last of her silver, her face unreadable. She would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She bought what she needed and left, herding her small, noisy flock out of town. The journey back was a chaotic, frustrating ordeal, trying to coax the stubborn goats and terrified chickens over the rocky terrain. But as she led them into the quarry, into the shelter she had built with her own hands, a feeling of deep, quiet pride settled over her. This was hers, this strange, warm, impossible home. Boro was her constant shadow, her silent partner. He had stood guard during the long weeks of building, his presence a comfort in the crushing loneliness. When she herded the goats and chickens into a separate alcove she had walled off deeper in the fissure, he seemed to understand they were part of the sanctuary. He appointed himself their guardian, sleeping at the entrance to their pen, a low growl in his chest at any strange night sound. He was the warmth at her feet on the sleeping platform, the alert ears that caught the scuttling of a mouse, the wet nose that nudged her awake in the mornings. He was the living, breathing soul of her stone home. The story of her purchase traveled faster than she did. The whispers in Providence Creek solidified into a narrative of madness. They stopped calling it Gideon's Folly. Now they spoke of the Folly Girl, or, in more hushed and fearful tones, the Quarry Witch. Children were warned not to wander too far into the hills, lest the strange woman who lived in the rocks catch them. The tale became a local legend, a cautionary story about pride and grief. One afternoon, Brant the hunter rode out to sea for himself. He reined in his horse at the edge of the quarry and stared down at the crude stone wall and the heavy wooden door. It was a bleak, strange sight. He saw no chimney, no sign of smoke, nothing to indicate life but the faint bleating of a goat. He laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed off the rock. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "Building a tomb for yourself, Ilara?" he shouted, his voice dripping with scorn. "You'll be frozen stiff by first snow. The wolves will appreciate the meal." He waited for a reply, but none came. The silence from the stone wall was more unnerving than an argument. He shook his head, spurred his horse, and rode away, the story of his visit adding another layer to Ilara's legend. Autumn bled into winter. The sky turned the color of lead, and the air grew sharp with the promise of frost. The first snows came, a light dusting at first, then a thicker blanket that covered the land in white. Ilara's world shrank to the confines of her stone shelter. A deep, quiet routine took hold. Her days were marked by simple, essential tasks. Each morning she would rise from her warm stone bed and tend the small cooking fire. The smell of wood smoke, contained within her home, mingled with the scent of damp earth and warm stone. She would milk the goats, their warm flanks a comfort against the chill air. The chickens, surprisingly content in their stone coop, provided an egg or two each day, a small, perfect miracle she treated with reverence. She would check her garden, where pale green shoots were pushing up through the dark soil, defying the dead world outside. The constant, gentle heat from the floor created a bizarre subterranean spring. She tended her water source, ensuring the channel was clear. She salted meat, repaired her worn clothes with a needle and thread, and spent hours just listening to the silence, a silence broken only by the soft sounds of her animals or the rustle of Boro shifting in his sleep. Outside, the wind would pick up, moaning around the quarry walls. But inside her fortress of rock, it was just a distant whisper. She was utterly alone, a solitary queen in a kingdom of stone and warmth. But she was not lonely. She was the master of her world, every part of it built by her own will and her own two hands. Her systems were tested. One night, a pack of wolves, lean and hungry with the coming winter, were drawn by the scent of the goats. Their howls echoed through the quarry, a chilling, predatory sound. Boro stood before the door, the fur on his back rigid, a deep, continuous growl rumbling in his chest. The wolves scratched and snarled at the heavy wood, but the door, built of solid pine, held firm. The stone walls were impassable. After an hour, they gave up and moved on, their frustrated howls fading into the distance. Ilara calmed the frightened goats, her hand steady. Her shelter had held. Another test came from the mountain itself. After a heavy rain followed by a snap freeze, a section of the quarry wall above her entrance gave way. A small rock slide buried her door under a pile of icy rock and debris. For 2 days she was trapped inside. She had food, water, and warmth, but the feeling of being entombed was terrifying. Using the pick and a makeshift shovel, she worked from the inside, slowly, carefully, dislodging rocks and pushing them away until she had cleared a path. When she finally pushed the door open to a sliver of gray daylight, she took a deep breath of the freezing air, her heart pounding with relief. She had overcome, she adapted, she endured. Then came the great blizzard of '83. It did not arrive like a normal storm. It came like an army, announced by a sky the color of a fresh bruise and a silence that felt heavy and menacing. Then the wind began, a low moan that grew into a piercing, relentless shriek. It was a physical presence, a thing with claws and teeth that tore at the world. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, stinging torrent of white that erased the landscape. The temperature plummeted, a descent into a cold so profound it felt like the end of the world. In Providence Creek, the flimsy confidence of the town shattered. The wind found every crack and flaw in their wooden homes. It ripped shingles from roofs and shattered window panes. The snow, driven by the gale, was like fine sand, forcing its way through every gap, piling in drifts inside houses. Chimneys, coated in ice, failed to draw, filling rooms with choking smoke. Families abandoned their homes, fighting their way through the storm to the relative safety of the meeting hall, their faces wrapped in scarves that froze solid in minutes. The town's preparations, adequate for a normal winter, were a mockery in the face of this monstrosity. Stockpiles of firewood vanished in a desperate attempt to fight a cold that seemed to radiate from the very air itself. Livestock, left in barns that were little more than wooden shells, began to freeze where they stood. The meeting hall, packed with shivering families, groaned under the immense weight of the snow piling on its roof. A loud crack echoed through the building as a main beam splintered. Panic began to set in. The community, so sure of its ways, so confident in its collective wisdom, was failing. The town was dying. Inside Ilara's quarry, the storm was an abstraction. The roar of the wind was muted by tons of solid rock, reduced to a deep, resonant hum, the sound of the mountain breathing. The geothermal warmth rose from the floor, a silent, unceasing river of heat that kept the air in her shelter at a steady, comfortable temperature. Her small fire crackled merrily, used only for cooking a stew of salted meat and the pale carrots from her impossible garden. Her animals were calm and safe in their stone enclosure, insulated from the frozen hell outside. She had fresh water from her cistern. She had food. She had light. She was not fighting the storm. She had built her life in a place the storm could not touch. She was an island of life and order in a world consumed by chaos and death. On the third night of the blizzard, as the wind reached a fever pitch, a new sound broke through the deep hum of the mountain, a frantic, rhythmic banging against her outer door. It was a sound so alien in her solitary world that for a moment she thought she had imagined it. But it came again, louder, more desperate. Boro shot to his feet, a warning bark erupting from his chest. Elara quieted him with a hand on his head, her heart pounding. No one could be out in this. It was impossible. She took a burning piece of wood from the fire for light and unbarred the heavy door, pulling it inward just a crack. A blast of impossibly cold air and stinging snow shot into the room. A figure, more a shape of ice and snow than a man, stumbled forward and collapsed onto her floor. It was Brant, the hunter. The man who had mocked her, who had laughed at her tomb. His face was a mask of frozen desperation, his eyes wild with terror. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raw. "My son, he's sick, a fever, the roof of our cabin, it's gone, my wife. She's trying to keep him alive, but our fire is out. We're freezing." He was weeping, his body racked with shivers that were too violent to be from the cold alone. He was a man utterly broken. Elara looked down at him. The memory of his mocking laughter echoed in her mind. "Building a tomb for yourself, Elara?" He and the others had cast her out, dismissed her, laughed at her struggle. They had left her for dead. Now he was at her door, begging for the life of his child. A bitter, cold part of her wanted to shut the door, to leave him to the storm he felt so superior to. It would be justice. She looked at her carefully rationed stack of firewood, her stores of food. Helping him, helping his family, would put her own survival at risk. It was a choice. But then she looked at his face, no longer the face of a mocker, but simply a father, terrified of losing his child. The choice was not about justice, it was about what she had become. Had she built this sanctuary only for herself? She had survived not through bitterness, but through labor and ingenuity. To turn him away would be to let the coldness of their world finally seep into her own heart. She would not let that happen. She made the decision in an instant. "Bring them here," she said, her voice firm. She pulled Brant further inside, seating him near the fire. She moved with a purpose that left no room for argument. She gave him a ladle of hot broth, forcing him to drink. Then she took a burning branch from her fire, wrapped its base in damp rags, and thrust it into his hands. "This will light your way." She pulled out a small, sturdy sled she had built for hauling firewood, and loaded it with thick goat-hide blankets. Then she looked at Boro. "Go with him," she commanded, her voice soft. "Guide him." The dog seemed to understand. He licked her hand once, then turned and followed Brant back out into the screaming white darkness. Hours crawled by. Elara waited, the silence of her home now filled with a tense anticipation. She prepared more broth, laid out more blankets. She worried not just for Brant and his family, but for Boro, her loyal companion, out in that maelstrom. Finally, she heard scratching at the door. She threw it open. Brant was there half-carrying his wife, who was numb with cold. On the sled wrapped in the blankets was a small boy, his face flushed with fever, and leading them all, his coat thick with ice, was Boro. They stumbled into the warmth, and the shock of it stopped them cold. Their eyes, accustomed to a world of white and gray and freezing death, struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. The gentle, pervasive warmth that came not from a fire, but from the very floor. The calm, healthy animals watching them from a stone pen, and, most impossibly, the row of green plants growing in a bed of dark earth along the far wall. Brant's wife stared at it, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears streamed down her frozen cheeks. It was a sanctuary. It was a miracle. Elara wasted no time. She took the sick boy, unwrapped him, and placed him on her own sleeping platform, the warmest place in the shelter. She spooned broth into his mouth and placed cool, damp cloths on his forehead. As she worked, Brant stood motionless, his gaze sweeping over the impossible room. He looked at the neatly stacked firewood, the cistern of clear water, the ingenious chimney that drew the smoke away into the rock. He looked at the evidence of years of relentless, intelligent labor. He saw not a tomb, but the most vital and well-designed home he had ever entered. He turned to Alara, his face a ruin of shame and awe. His voice, when he spoke, was a choked whisper. "We called you a fool," he said, the words tearing out of him. "We laughed at you. My God, Alara, we were the fools, all of us." He sank onto a stone bench, his head in his hands. The town. It's falling apart. People are freezing in the meeting hall. Gideon. His greed. He sold all the extra firewood. Now there's none left. Alara looked up from the child she was tending. She saw the hunter's broken pride, the wife's silent, grateful tears. There was nothing to say. Revenge was a cold, empty thing. What she had built here was warm and real. She simply ladled more stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to Brant. "There is food," she said quietly. "Eat. Your son needs you strong." Her grace was a force more powerful than the storm, a warmth that had nothing to do with the geothermal vents. It was the quiet, unassailable strength of her character. Before the night was over, guided by Brant, more survivors from the town began to arrive, a staggered procession of the desperate and the freezing. She took them all in. When the great blizzard finally broke after 5 days, the world was silent, white, and transformed. Nearly a dozen souls from Providence Creek had found refuge in Alara's quarry. They emerged from the warmth of the fissure and blinked at a sun that seemed impossibly bright, sparkling on a landscape buried under immense drifts of snow. They returned to a town that was shattered, not just in its structures, but in its certainty. Gideon's authority was gone, evaporated in the face of the lethal cold his money could not stop. His mercantile was a hollow shell, his reputation ruined by stories of his hoarding and price gouging. He was met with silent, accusing stares. He had championed the conventional wisdom that had failed them all, while the woman he had cast out had saved them. The shame diminished him, leaving him a small, bitter man in a town that no longer looked to him for guidance. The nickname Quarry Witch was never spoken again. If the place was mentioned, it was with a new name, spoken in tones of awe and reverence, Alara's Hearth. The story of the woman who built her home inside the warm rock spread far beyond Providence Creek. In the years that followed, people came not to gawk or mock, but to learn. They saw the simple, profound wisdom in what she had done. They saw how she had listened to the land, found its hidden strengths, and built with it, not just upon it. The houses rebuilt in Providence Creek were different. They were dug deeper into the hillsides with thick stone foundations and sod roofs. They were built to endure, to work with the wind and the cold, not just to defy them. Alara's quarry was no longer a scar on the land. It became a place of life, a testament to resilience. She traded her surplus vegetables, eggs, and goat cheese for things she could not make. She taught others how to find the clay for mortar, how to build a roof that would hold against the wind. She never married again, but she was never alone. Her home was a meeting place, a source of strength for the community she had single-handedly saved. Years later, an older Alara stood at the entrance of her home, looking out over the quarry. Borrow's descendant, a fine, strong hound, lay at her feet. The walls of the quarry were now terraced, home to thriving gardens in the summer months. The community of Providence Creek was stronger, humbler, and wiser than it had ever been. She had never sought praise or apology. She had never gloated. She had simply taken the worthless, discarded things she was given, and with her own 2 hands, built a life of substance and warmth. Her legacy was not etched in stone or written in a book. It was in the quiet, unyielding strength of a woman who refused to be broken, and in the profound moral courage to offer warmth to a world that had shown her nothing but cold.